Little girl saw a German shepherd guarding a homeless woman. What happened next left all in tears. Sometimes, all it takes is one moment of unexpected bravery to change everything. A child's simple act of kindness will leave you speechless. You won't believe what happens next. Like, share and subscribe. This is the kind of story that restores your faith in humanity. It was the kind of winter morning that seemed to hold its breath. The park lay quiet under a thin veil of frost, every blade of grass coated in silver, sparkling faintly in the pale dawn light. The air was cold enough to bite, turning each breath into a little cloud that drifted away before disappearing. Somewhere in the distance, the muffled hum of the city could be heard, but here, the stillness felt almost complete. A small figure walked slowly along the winding path, 7-year-old Lily, her mittened hands wrapped tightly around a steaming cup of cocoa. Wisps of steam curled upward, brushing her rosy cheeks. Her wool hat was pulled down low over her ears, the edges brushing the tops of her dark eyes. Beside her, her father kept an easy pace, his boots crunching softly over the frost-dusted ground. They were halfway through the park when Lily stopped abruptly. Her father, caught mid-step, turned to see what had frozen her in place. "Lily?" he asked quietly. But she didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed on a worn wooden bench sitting under the bare, skeletal branches of an old maple tree. Upon it, a figure lay huddled beneath layers of tattered coats and threadbare blankets, motionless except for the slow rise and fall of their chest. The sight alone might have been enough to draw concern, but it wasn't the sleeping figure that held Lily so still. It was the dog. A large German shepherd, for a patchwork of deep black and warm brown, was curled along the length of the bench. His body was pressed protectively against the bundled figure, his head lifted just enough to watch. His amber eyes were sharp yet calm, locked on Lily with quiet intensity. The steady rhythm of his breathing was the only sound she seemed to notice now, slow and deliberate, as if he was guarding more than just the person beside him. The cold breeze carried the earthy scent of damp leaves, mingling with the faint aroma of Lily's cocoa. A bus rumbled by somewhere beyond the park gates, but the moment here felt suspended, a quiet pocket of time where the only things that mattered were the frost beneath their feet, the stillness of the morning, and the unspoken message in the dog's gaze. Lily's fingers tightened around her cup. She couldn't explain why, but she felt as if she were standing in front of a story, one that had already begun long before she arrived. The dog didn't bark. He didn't move. But those eyes, they held her there, asking her something without a single sound. Her father stepped closer, his voice gentle. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's keep walking." But Lily stayed where she was. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely louder than the whisper of the wind. "Daddy, why is he here?" Her father had no ready answer. The frost glistened between them, the bundled figure slept on, and the German shepherd never broke his gaze. What Lily saw in that moment would change everything. Morning in this part of the city didn't wake up with a jolt. It stretched, yawned, and rolled gently into the day. Down one narrow street, the first rays of sunlight glinted off the worn red bricks of buildings that had stood for nearly a century. Their windows bore flower boxes, now empty for winter, and their steps were dusted with a fine frost. The scent of fresh bread drifted from the corner bakery, its door propped open just enough for warmth and aroma to spill onto the sidewalk. A shopkeeper across the way swept salt over the front steps of his store, pausing every so often to wave to early passers-by. This was the quieter side of the city, the side where faces were familiar, names remembered, and stories often told over coffee rather than screens. Here, people noticed the small things, who had put up new curtains, who was painting their stoop, and who hadn't been seen for a few days. Lily loved these streets. She had grown up wandering them with her father, stopping to press her nose against the bakery window, or to ask if she could pet the dog tied outside the post office. She was 7 years old, with the kind of curiosity that never just looked. It studied, it wondered, it wanted to understand. Dogs, especially, had a special pull on her. Whether big or small, shy or friendly, she always crouched down to meet their eyes, speaking to them as if she and they shared a secret language. And that was how she had first seen Shadow. He was a German Shepherd unlike any she had met before. Strong in build, with fur the color of deep coffee and charcoal smoke, and eyes so alert they seemed to notice everything. But what struck Lily most wasn't his size or his power, it was the way he looked at people. Not in the eager, tail-wagging way of dogs who waited for treats, but with a steady, measuring gaze, as if weighing the world and deciding where he stood. Shadow was never alone. He was always with Grace. Grace was a woman who carried the kind of quiet that made people lower their voices when she passed. She looked to be in her mid-50s, her hair streaked with silver, worn under a knitted cap. Layers of coats and scarves shielded her from the cold, though no layer seemed thick enough to fight off the bite of winter nights. She rarely spoke, but when she did, it was polite, measured, and brief. Most days, she could be found on the same park bench or at the edge of the community garden, Shadow at her side like a sentinel. No one in the neighborhood quite knew her story. Some said she had once worked in one of the shops that had since closed. Others believed she had come here from another city altogether. What everyone agreed on was that Grace kept to herself, and that Shadow never let her out of his sight. It wasn't unusual for Lily and her father to see them on their morning walks, Grace sipping something from a paper cup, and Shadow, eyes scanning the street, a calm wall of fur and loyalty. Sometimes Lily would wave, and Grace would offer the smallest of smiles. Shadow, however, would always meet Lily's gaze with that same quiet watchfulness, as though memorizing her face. Winter had been tightening its grip in recent weeks. The days grew shorter, the air sharper. Locals had started talking, not in gossip, but in concern. A storm was coming, the weather reports warned. Nights would be colder than they had been in years. People worried for those sleeping rough, for the ones with no walls but the ones they could make from blankets and coats. It was on one of these mornings, the frost still clinging stubbornly to the grass, that Lily and her father had wandered into the park, cocoa in her hands. And it was there, in that quiet space between night and day, that Lily saw Shadow again. Only this time, something in his posture told her this was no ordinary morning. Lily's eyes stayed locked on the German Shepherd, the steam from her cocoa curling up and vanishing into the cold air between them. She could feel her father's presence just behind her, the steady warmth of his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "Daddy," she said quietly, "who is she?" Her father glanced toward the bench, then back down at his daughter. He hesitated, and Lily noticed it, the way he searched for the right words, as if he were looking for a path in a fog. "She doesn't have a home," he said finally, his voice low. "Sometimes people end up living outside, in parks or on the street. It's not because they want to. It just happens." Lily frowned, trying to imagine not having a bedroom, not having a kitchen where cocoa was made in the morning. "And the dog?" she asked. Her father looked back at the bench. "That's her dog. He's probably all she has. And she's all he has." Lily turned her gaze back to the shepherd. Shadow hadn't moved an inch since she'd first seen him. He was lying along the length of the bench, his head slightly raised, front paws stretched forward, body curved protectively around the woman sleeping under the heap of blankets. Even in stillness, he seemed alert, the faint twitch of his ears at the sound of a bird's wings, the shift of his eyes when a jogger passed far in the distance. The woman, Grace, though Lily didn't know her name yet, was curled up tightly, her face mostly hidden under the layers. Her breathing was slow and even, and every now and then, she shivered beneath the blankets. Shadow didn't look away from Lily, But there was no growl, no warning. Just a steady watchfulness, like a guard who recognized a visitor but hadn't decided whether to open the gates. Lily crouched down, her knees pressing into the cold ground. She set her cocoa cup on the path in front of her, steam still rising from it. "Hi," she whispered, not sure if she was talking to the dog or the woman. She slid the cup forward a little, the cardboard scraping softly against the frost-speckled pavement. Shadow's nose twitched. He didn't move right away, but his eyes flicked to the cup, then back to Lily's face. The smell of chocolate drifted upward, mixing with the damp scent of winter leaves. Her father took a small step forward, ready to call her back, but Lily didn't move. Her mittened hands rested in her lap, her eyes wide, waiting. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with slow, deliberate grace, Shadow rose to his feet. The movement was fluid, powerful, but unhurried, like a soldier standing at attention. He stepped down from the bench, paused making no sound on the ground, and stood tall between Lily and the woman. His head lowered slightly, eyes steady, as if he were weighing something invisible. Lily's heart thudded against her ribs. She could feel the cold air on her cheeks, hear the faint rustle of his fur as he shifted. Shadow looked at the cocoa again, then back at her, then over his shoulder at Grace. His tail didn't wag, but his stance softened, just barely. It was in that moment, standing on that frost-covered path, that Lily knew a choice was being made. Not by her father, but by the dog. The frost was sharper that morning. Each breath rose in little clouds, hanging for a moment before vanishing into the pale winter air. Lily's boots crunched over the thin layer of ice along the park's pathway, her small hands buried deep in the warmth of her coat pockets. Beside her, her father carried a paper bag from the bakery, and tucked inside Lily's own tote bag was a carefully packed thermos of cocoa. She had insisted on it the night before. "Dogs get cold too, Daddy. We should take something warm for him," she had said, her tone not one of suggestion, but of certainty. The bench under the maple tree came into view, framed by the pale light of morning. Grace was there, exactly as they had left her the day before, curled under layers of worn blankets, her shoulders rising and falling in the steady rhythm of sleep. Shadow lay pressed against her side, his thick coat brushed with a faint frost, his head resting on his paws. But as always, his eyes were open, watching the world around him. When he saw Lily, his head lifted, ears twitching forward. His gaze followed her like a silent sentinel. She slowed her pace, the sound of the paper bag rustling softly as her father passed it to her. Without breaking eye contact, she crouched a few feet away from him, set a biscuit on the ground, and pushed it toward him across the frost. For a long moment, he didn't move. The cold wind rustled the bare branches above, sending a few brittle leaves tumbling down between them. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, Shadow rose from his place beside Grace. His paws made no sound on the icy path. He lowered his head, sniffed the biscuit, then took it gently between his teeth. It was the first time. The first time he had accepted something from her hand. The next day she came again. And the day after that. The park became their meeting ground, the bench their quiet stage. Sometimes she brought ham from her breakfast plate, wrapped carefully in foil to keep it warm. Sometimes a small bottle of water. Other days just more biscuits. And each time she came, she spoke to him softly, telling him about her school day, the story her teacher had read aloud, or the silly thing her cat had done at home. Shadow began to change. The stillness in his body softened. His tail gave a slow, careful wag when she appeared. He came to meet her halfway along the path. On the fourth morning, he let her place her mittened hand on the side of his neck. She felt the deep warmth of his fur under her fingers, the steady strength in the muscles there. He leaned into her touch, just slightly, as though he wanted her to know she was welcome. The sixth morning was colder still, the kind of cold that seeped through fabric and nipped at skin. Lily spotted Shadow before she even turned the corner toward the bench. He was sitting up straight this time, his gaze fixed in her direction. Grace was awake. She was sitting upright, her blanket pulled close around her shoulders. Her eyes, pale and rimmed with tiredness, followed Lily as she approached. "You've made a friend," Grace said quietly, her voice carrying just enough to reach her. Lily stopped a step away. "His name is Shadow?" Grace nodded. "That's right. He's been with me for years." Her gaze shifted to the dog, who now stood beside Lily, his head turned back toward Grace as if checking for her approval. "How did you meet him?" Lily asked. Grace's smile was faint, but it softened the lines in her face. "One winter, much colder than this one, I found him behind an old warehouse. He'd been hurt, limping, no collar, nothing to show where he'd come from. I didn't have much, but I couldn't walk away. I gave him the little I had, and I guess he decided to return the favor by staying." Lily's mitten brushed over the top of Shadow's head. "He's lucky you found him." Grace shook her head. "I think I'm the lucky one." That morning, for the first time, Lily climbed onto the bench beside Grace. Shadow followed, pressing himself close, his body a warm wall between the two. After a moment, he eased down and rested his head directly in Lily's lap. She could feel the weight of it, the soft huff of his breath against her coat, the gentle rise and fall of his chest. They sat like that for a long time, the silence filled with the distant hum of the city, the rustle of wind through the bare branches, and the occasional call of a bird. It was the kind of quiet that didn't need filling. A man passing through the park stopped briefly near the bench. He greeted Grace with a polite nod, then glanced toward Lily. "Cold's coming in fast," he said, his voice carrying a note of concern. "They're saying it'll drop below freezing tomorrow night. Coldest in years." Grace nodded, her expression unreadable, but Lily noticed the way her fingers tightened on the edge of her blanket. Shadow's head lifted from her lap, and he pressed himself closer to Grace, his watchful eyes sweeping the park. The man walked on, leaving behind the weight of his words. Lily's father, standing a short distance away, caught her gaze. There was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Worry, perhaps, or the early shape of a decision he hadn't yet voiced. The frost beneath her boots seemed sharper, the air around them colder. And that was how it happened. The slow opening of a door that had been locked for years, the fragile thread of trust growing stronger with each morning. But now, with the freezing night only a day away, that thread would be tested in ways none of them could yet imagine. The cold came like a silent thief in the night. It crept between the brick walls of the old buildings, swept through the empty alleys, and pressed its icy breath against every windowpane in the city. Frost grew thick over every surface, glazing the benches, the trash bins, and the brittle grass of the park in a silver armor. Even the air itself felt brittle, snapping at exposed skin with every gust of wind. Lily lay in bed, cocooned in her blankets, but the warmth did nothing to settle her mind. The image of Grace sitting on that park bench, shoulders hunched under thin layers, kept pressing into her thoughts. And Shadow, always pressed close against her side, always watching. She pictured him now with frost collecting along the tips of his fur. Her father had told her that Grace knew how to take care of herself, but Lily could hear the way he'd said it. Gently, carefully, the way grown-ups speak when they're trying to keep you from worrying too much. She rolled over, watching the clock. Each red digit seemed to pulse louder than the last. Midnight. 1 o'clock. Somewhere between the ticking minutes and the soft hum of the radiator, she made up her mind. She would go see them, and she would not go empty-handed. By the time the first faint gray light of morning crept into the sky, she was already in the kitchen, pulling out the heavy wool blanket from the hall closet. She poured cocoa into the thermos with shaking hands, the steam curling up into the cold air, and packed bread rolls into a paper bag. Her father found her there, half-dressed in her coat, boots already on. He didn't ask questions. He just nodded once, pulled on his own jacket, and took the blanket from her arms. The streets were silent as they walked, the only sound their boots crunching over ice and snow. Every shop window they passed was dark. Even the bakery's sign, usually lit before dawn, was still cold and lifeless. A bitter wind carried the faint rattle of bare branches, and somewhere in the distance, the hiss of a bus door opening and closing echoed briefly before the silence swallowed it again. They reached the park, and the frost was so thick it looked like the grass had been painted white. The maple tree stood stark against the pale morning sky, its branches heavy with ice. And there, on the familiar bench, they saw them. Grace was curled into herself, her blanket drawn up to her chin, her skin pale in the dim light. Shadow was pressed so close against her that his breath rose in tiny clouds against her cheek. His head was lowered, his body curved protectively, as though he could block out the cold with his own weight alone. His eyes lifted when he saw Lily, and for the first time, they looked almost desperate. Lily hurried forward, the thermos clutched tight in her hands. "Grace?" she said softly, her breath puffing in the air. The woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open just enough to see them. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Her father was beside her in an instant, pulling the heavy wool blanket around Grace's shoulders, tucking it under her chin. "We need to call someone," he said, his voice sharp with urgency now. He handed Lily the thermos and stepped back to pull his phone from his pocket. Shadow stayed exactly where he was, his gaze darting between Grace and the strangers rushing toward her. When Lily knelt beside him and placed a hand on his neck, he didn't move away. Instead, he let her fingers tangle in the thick fur there, his breath hot against her wrist. The sound of her father's voice carried low and quick over the line. "Yes, she's conscious, but she's cold, really cold. Breathing is shallow. She's in the park, near the maple on the south path. Yes, bring a team." He hung up and crouched beside them, his gloved hand resting briefly on Shadow's back. "They're on their way." Minutes stretched like hours. Lily poured cocoa into the small lid cup and held it to Grace's lips. The woman took a sip, the steam fogging the air between them, and her eyes found Lily's for a brief, fragile moment. It was a look of gratitude, but also of something heavier, the kind of tiredness that runs deeper than the body. The wail of sirens broke the quiet, low at first, then rising until it seemed to echo off every wall around them. Blue and red lights cut through the pale morning haze as the ambulance pulled up along the park's edge. Two paramedics in thick jackets hurried toward the bench, their boots kicking up sprays of frost. They worked with a calm efficiency, speaking to Grace in soft tones, wrapping her in a heated foil blanket, checking her pulse. One of them crouched low to meet Shadow's gaze, offering a gloved hand for him to sniff. Shadow didn't move from Grace's side until they gently lifted her onto a stretcher. Even then, he paced alongside them, his paws slipping slightly on the frozen path. When they reached the ambulance, one paramedic looked at Lily's father. "He's not going to leave her, is he?" Her father shook his head. "Not a chance." The man smiled faintly and held the back door open wider. "Then he comes with us." Shadow leapt inside without hesitation, his eyes never leaving Grace's face. The doors closed with a heavy thud, and the engine rumbled to life. The flashing lights reflected off the frost as the ambulance pulled away, leaving the park in a deep, cold stillness once more. Lily stood there a moment longer, clutching the empty thermos to her chest. She could still feel the warmth of Shadow's fur against her hands, still see the way his body curved protectively around Grace. And she knew, no matter how cold the winter became, that bond would never break. Word of that frosty morning traveled faster than the winter wind. By the time the sun had fully climbed above the rooftops, neighbors were already whispering about the little girl who had brought blankets and hot cocoa to a woman and her loyal dog in the park. It wasn't gossip in the usual sense, it was something softer, warmer. People spoke of it with a kind of reverence, the way you talk about something that has nudged your own heart a little closer to kindness. Mrs. Carter, who ran the corner bakery, heard it from a customer and left a tray of fresh rolls on her counter marked for Grace. The pharmacist at the end of Main Street made a few quiet calls, arranging for someone from the community clinic to stop by the shelter that evening. Even the grocer, a man known for his no-nonsense manner, was seen slipping a paper bag full of canned soup into a donation bin without a word. Within 2 days, the story had made its way to the local paper. The headlines sat in bold above a photograph of Lily kneeling in the frost beside Shadow. Little girl's act of kindness warms the coldest morning. The article told of Grace's condition, how she'd been released from the hospital with clean clothes and a warm meal waiting for her at the community center, and how Shadow had never once left her side through it all. The community center became the heart of the transformation. When Grace walked in for the first time, her steps were hesitant, her shoulders drawn tight under a thick borrowed coat. But she was met not with pity, but with open smiles and the smell of hot stew drifting from the kitchen. Shadow trotted beside her, his tail swishing cautiously until he recognized familiar scents, bread from the bakery, biscuits from the cafe, all sent with quiet love. It was the seniors who rallied first. Many of them remembered colder times in their own lives, when a knock at the door with a loaf of bread or a warm coat had meant the difference between despair and hope. Mr. Jenkins, who was well into his 70s, recalled the winter of '68 when a neighbor had lent his family a kerosene heater during a power outage. "We survived because someone cared," he said simply, handing Grace a knitted scarf his late wife had made. Even the children seemed to catch the spark of it. A group from the elementary school decorated a shoebox with paper hearts and left it at the front desk of the center, labeled for Grace and Shadow. Inside were coins, crayons, and carefully folded notes in messy handwriting. "I hope you stay warm. Shadow is a good dog. We love you." Grace kept the box on the small nightstand beside her new bed at the shelter, pulling out the notes on days when the world still felt heavy. Shadow changed too. The hard edge in his watchfulness began to soften. He still kept close to Grace, but his eyes were brighter now, his movements looser, as though he knew the danger had passed. He played fetch in the community center yard with some of the children, his bark echoing between the brick walls. Sometimes, when Grace laughed, a sound that had been rare and fragile at first, Shadow would bound toward her, pressing his nose into her hand like he was reminding her that joy was worth holding on to. Lily visited often. She would sit cross-legged on the floor while Shadow sprawled across her lap, Grace watching with that quiet, thoughtful smile she now carried more often. One afternoon, as Lily's father chatted with the center staff, Grace leaned forward and said softly, "I don't know if I'd be here without you." Lily's small brow furrowed as though she didn't understand. "You're here because you're strong," she replied simply, giving Shadow a playful scratch behind the ear. The town had no official announcement, no grand ceremony, but the transformation was visible in the smallest ways. A fresh coat of paint appeared on the bench where Grace used to sleep. The shelter's pantry stayed stocked a little longer each week. And whenever Grace and Shadow walked down Main Street now, they were met with nods, greetings, and sometimes even a biscuit slipped from a pocket. The narrator's voice could have been any one of the townsfolk reflecting on the change. Kindness is contagious, and sometimes it starts with the smallest hands. One small act on a cold morning rippled through an entire community, thawing something in all of us. The room was small but warm, its single window letting in a shaft of afternoon light that fell across the worn carpet. Grace sat in a cushioned armchair, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that steamed gently in the still air. Across from her, Lily perched on the edge of the couch beside her father, legs swinging slightly as she hummed under her breath. Between them, sprawled on the rug as if he'd finally decided he could let his guard down, was Shadow, his head resting on Lily's knee, eyes half closed in pure contentment. It had been weeks since that freezing morning in the park. The color had returned to Grace's cheeks, her voice no longer hoarse from the cold. She wore the knitted scarf Mr. Jenkins had given her, and though her clothes were simple, there was a quiet dignity in the way she held herself now. Her gaze, once wary and downcast, lifted often to meet Lily's, a faint smile pulling at her lips. "Thank you," she said at last, her voice soft but steady. She looked at Lily first, then at her father. "For that morning, for seeing me, for seeing us." Lily glanced down at Shadow and gave his ear a gentle tug. "You're welcome," she replied simply, as if there were nothing more to say. Shadow gave a low, contented sigh, the kind of sound only a dog makes when every part of him feels safe. His tail tapped once against the floor, and he shifted just enough to nudge his nose closer to Lily's hand. Grace reached down to smooth the fur along his back, her fingers moving slowly, like she was memorizing the feel of the one companion who had never left her side. The conversation drifted to lighter things, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery down the street, a stray cat that had been hanging around the community center, the way Shadow had started chasing snowflakes during their walks. Laughter slipped into the room in small bursts, as easy and unforced as the steam curling from Grace's tea. Outside, the day was folding into evening, the pale winter sky turning a soft shade of gold. Through the window, the city seemed quieter, gentler. The park bench where it had all begun was still there, dusted now with frost, but it felt like a relic from another lifetime, a place where walls had been built and then, slowly, taken down. The narrator's voice softened as if speaking directly to the heart. Sometimes the walls we build around our hearts are only waiting for the right person to knock. And sometimes that knock comes from the smallest hand, holding out the warmest gift. The camera's focus lingered on the three of them, Grace in her chair, Lily leaning forward to whisper something to Shadow, and the dog's slow, steady blink in reply. A faint smile crossed Grace's face, the kind that stays even after the moment passes. As the scene began to fade, the notes of a soft piano melody drifted in, each one falling like snow over the images still fresh in the mind. The final frame caught the glint of the tea's steam in the golden light, a symbol of warmth reclaimed. The narrator spoke once more, the words an invitation rather than an ending. If you've ever witnessed a friendship you never saw coming, if you've ever felt the quiet power of a small act that changed everything, share your story. Somewhere, someone is waiting to hear it. The screen dipped to black, leaving only the gentle piano and the lingering sense that, even in the coldest seasons, warmth has a way of finding its way back. And so we wrap up this tale, but there's always more to come. If this story moved you, share it, and let others feel the magic too. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that touch the heart.